The boy next door. He was the last person you'd ever suspect. A youth minister at his church, a trombone player in the Michigan State Marching Band, a clean-cut college student with a bright future. To everyone in East Lansing, Michigan, Donald Gene Miller was the quintessential boy next door. But in the quiet hours between 1977 and 1978, that same young man would become the center of a terrifying mystery, as four local women vanished without a trace. Their families were left with only questions, while the person who knew all the answers lived among them, hiding in plain sight. This is the story of a double life, a community's fear, and the one brutal mistake that finally pulled back the mask. The town of East Lansing, Michigan, in the mid-1970s, was the picture of quiet, middle-class American life. It was a community of neat lawns, good schools, and familiar faces. At the heart of this community was a young man who seemed to embody its very best values. Donald Gene Miller, Don to those who knew him, was a polite, clean-cut student. He had graduated from East Lansing High School, where he was in the marching band. He was a youth minister at his church. He enrolled at Michigan State University to study criminal justice, a solid career path for a respectable young man. By all outward appearances, he was on the right track, but beneath that polished surface, a deep and dangerous rage was simmering, a rage that would soon devastate multiple families and shatter the peace of his hometown forever. Don's world seemed stable, anchored by his relationship with his girlfriend, Martha Sue Young. She was a 19-year-old French major at Michigan State, and their courtship followed a familiar, respectable path. In late 1976, their relationship took what seemed like a natural next step. Don proposed, and Martha accepted. It was a decision that should have led to a shared future. But just days later, Martha had a change of heart. She broke off the engagement. The rejection was a seismic shock to Don Miller's world. He convinced her to see him one more time, to talk things over as friends. On New Year's Eve 1976, Martha Sue Young went out with her former fiancé. As the clock ticked over into the early hours of January 1, 1977, she was with Don Miller. And then she was gone. When Martha didn't return home, her parents immediately knew something was wrong. They contacted the police. The investigation quickly led them to the last person known to have seen Martha alive, Don Miller. He was detained and questioned. His story was simple, and he stuck to it. He told the police that he had dropped Martha off at her doorstep around 2 in the morning and then driven home. It was a story that couldn't be disproven. There was no body, there was no crime scene, there was only a family's growing dread and a detective's gut feeling that something was terribly wrong. Without evidence, the authorities had no choice. They released Don Miller. He walked out of the interrogation room and back into his normal life, while Martha's family was left in a torturous limbo. For 9 months, Martha Sue Young's disappearance was a painful, open wound in the community. Then, on October 20, 1977, 2 hunters made a chilling discovery in a wooded area near Potter Lake in Bath Township. They found Martha's clothing and her purse. The clothes were laid out in a specific, disturbing way. Her underwear was found neatly folded inside her outer garments. Former Ingham County prosecutor Peter Houck would later describe the scene as being arranged, like she had ascended to heaven. It was a deliberate theatrical display. This was not a scene of panic. It was a posed tableau. The message to police was clear. The person who did this was playing with them. He was confident, he was in control, and he was still out there. The discovery confirmed everyone's worst fear. Martha was dead, but it gave no clear path to her killer. The prime suspect was still Don Miller, but suspicion is not enough for an arrest. The case grew cold, and the shadow over East Lansing deepened. Life in the college town tried to move on, but the shadow had not lifted, it had only grown. In the summer of 1978, a new wave of fear began. On June 15, a 27-year-old woman named Marita Chiquette vanished. She was an editorial assistant, at the local public television station WKAR-TV. She was responsible, she was liked, and then she was missing. About 2 weeks later, on June 27, a farmer found a horrifying scene on his property in Ileaden Township. Covered by white cement blocks was the body of Marita Chiquette. She had been stabbed 17 times. In a final act of grotesque violence, her hands had been severed from her arms and placed beside her. The brutality was shocking, a violent escalation from the strangulation of Martha Young. The police now had a body, but no leads, and the killer was just getting started. The very same day Marita Chiquette's body was discovered, June 27, 1978, another young woman disappeared. Wendy Bush was a 21-year-old junior at Michigan State University. Witnesses reported seeing her on campus, walking with a tall, young white man they didn't recognize. Then, she too was gone. The community was now gripped by a palpable terror. Women were warned not to walk alone. Parents held their children closer. The police were under immense pressure, but they had few pieces that seemed to connect. They did not yet know that these crimes were connected to Martha Young's death. They were hunting a ghost. The heat of that fearful summer stretched into August. On August 14, 1978, 30-year-old Christine Stewart finished her day. She was a beloved science teacher, a well-known and active member of the Lansing community. After leaving an auto repair shop, she began her walk home. She never made it. The only trace left behind was her tortoiseshell glasses found at the side of the road. Her husband, Ernest Stewart, was plunged into a nightmare. The disappearance of this vibrant, unique woman sent a fresh jolt of fear through the area. The police were now frantically investigating multiple disappearances and a mutilation murder, with a city looking to them for answers they didn't have. The killer was moving faster, becoming more brazen, and he was about to make the mistake that would change everything. That mistake would occur just 2 days later, on August 16, 1978. It did not happen on a dark street or a secluded parking lot. It happened in the one place every child is taught to feel safest, their own home. On Canal Road in Delta Township, 14-year-old Lisa Gilbert was home alone. A knock came at the door. Standing there was a young, polite-looking man. He asked if he could use her phone. It was a simple, believable request. Lisa let him in. Once inside, his demeanor changed instantly. He asked the girl for a pencil and paper to write down a number. When she turned to get it, he attacked. He tied her up, assaulted her, and began to strangle her. Lisa Gilbert was facing the same fate as the other women. But then, a sound. Her 13-year-old brother, Randy, was coming home. Hearing her brother, Lisa fought with everything she had. Her attacker, Don Miller, was momentarily distracted. He left Lisa to confront the new witness. In that split second, with her brother's life now in peril, Lisa saw her chance. She ran. She burst out of the house onto Canal Road. She was naked, with only nylon stockings tied around her wrists and her father's necktie, which had been used as a gag, around her neck. It was a sight that would haunt everyone who saw it. She ran directly into the path of an oncoming car. The driver, an Oldsmobile worker named James Regan, slammed on his brakes. Almost simultaneously, Delta Township Fire Chief Ken Doran was driving by. They both stopped. They saw the terror in the girl's eyes. They saw the marks on her body. And then they saw a brown 1973 Oldsmobile Cutlass speeding away from the house. Both men did something crucial. They memorized the license plate number. Inside the house, Randy Gilbert was fighting for his life. The attacker choked him until he lost consciousness. As Randy lay helpless, the man stabbed him 3 times, twice in the chest and once in the neck. He left the boy for dead. But Randy Gilbert, like his sister, was a fighter. He survived. Meanwhile, on the road, Lisa was surrounded by help. Another car, carrying a mother and her 13-year-old daughter, Cheryl Crapfaddock, also stopped. They took Lisa into their car, gave her clothing, and comforted her until police swarmed the scene. For the first time, the killer had left living witnesses, and he had left a license plate number. The information from the heroes on Canal Road led police directly to an apartment in East Lansing. Within hours of the attack, officers arrested Donald Gene Miller. He was charged with the rape of Lisa Gilbert and the attempted murder of both Lisa and Randy. The boy next door was in handcuffs. For the families of Martha Young, Marita Chiquette, Wendy Bush, and Christine Stewart, the arrest of Miller brought a complex storm of emotions. He was already their prime suspect. Now, with him behind bars for a horrific, unrelated attack, they dared to hope for answers. But they would soon learn that putting a suspect in a cell is a world away from proving he is a murderer. The trial for the attack on the Gilbert children began in the spring of 1979. Don Miller, facing overwhelming evidence, including eyewitness identification and physical evidence, mounted a surprising defense. He claimed he was insane. He and his attorneys said he suffered from multiple personality disorder. It was a calculated move. To the jury, he presented himself as a confused, troubled man not in control of his actions. But the prosecutor, a young attorney named G. Michael Hocking, saw through the act. He immersed himself in psychology books to dismantle the defense. The psychiatrists who evaluated Miller concluded he was sane, had a high IQ, and was deliberately trying to manipulate them. The performance did not work. On May 8, 1979, the jury found Donald Gene Miller guilty on all counts for the attack on the Gilbert siblings. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. He was going away for a long time, but for the families of the 4 murdered women, justice remained completely out of reach. Miller was now a convicted violent felon, safely imprisoned. But for the prosecutors in Ingham County, the job was unfinished. They were convinced Miller was the East Lansing serial killer. In February 1979, they had secured an indictment against him for the second-degree murder of Martha Sue Young and Christine Stewart. Yet they faced a monumental problem. They still had only one body, Marita Chiquette's, and no physical evidence linking Miller to it. The cases against him were built on circumstance, on timing, on his status as the last person to see the victims alive. It was a strong circumstantial case, but it was a gamble. Peter Houck, the Ingham County prosecutor, had to look the families in the eye and tell them the hard truth. They might go to trial and lose. If that happened, Miller would never be held accountable for the murders, and they might never recover their loved ones. Then, from his prison cell, Don Miller made an offer. It was the offer of a man who knew he held all the cards. In July 1979, he proposed a plea deal through his attorneys. He would plead guilty to the murders. He would tell the police exactly where he had dumped the bodies of Martha Young, Wendy Bush, and Christine Stewart. In return, he wanted something. He wanted the first-degree murder charges dropped. He wanted to avoid the possibility of a life sentence. In essence, he was trading the truth for a guaranteed chance at eventual freedom. For the prosecutors, it was a devil's bargain. For the families, it was a chance for closure, for a body to bury, for an end to the haunting question of where. After painful consultation with the victims' families, prosecutor Peter Houck accepted the deal. The pursuit of perfect justice was set aside for the certainty of resolution. On July 16, 1979, under heavy police escort, Don Miller was taken to Bath Township. He led authorities to Prigoris Park and showed them where he had left Martha Sue Young's body. The young woman who had rejected him was finally coming home. Next, he was driven to a farm field in Clinton County. He pointed to a drainage ditch near Jason Road and Old US 27. There, they found Christine Stewart. Later, in a memory jogging session with a therapist, Miller provided details on his other 2 victims. He led police to a small woodlot in Delta Township, where they found Wendy Bush. He confessed to strangling her in a parking lot near Spartan Stadium after she had refused his advances. He described killing Marita Chiquette, a woman he knew, after inviting her to breakfast. He explained he cut off her hands because he couldn't unlock the handcuffs he had placed on her. The stories were cold, clinical, and horrifying. In court, following the terms of the deal, Miller pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter for the deaths of Young and Stewart. The court did not add the other 2 confessions to the formal charges as part of the agreement. When asked by the judge to describe what he did, Miller was eerily calm. He said he strangled Martha Young in a fit of rage after she said she didn't love him. For Christine Stewart, he claimed he hit her with his car because, in the dark, he thought she was Martha Young, somehow returned from the dead. When she was unconscious and couldn't answer his questions, he strangled her. The judge, Robert Holmes Bell, remembered Miller as a nice-looking, clean-spoken man who seemed utterly relaxed as he described these brutal acts. For his guilty plea, Miller was sentenced to 10 to 15 years in prison, to be served at the same time as his 30 to 50-year sentence for the Gilbert attack. In practical terms, it added no additional time. The public and the victims' families were outraged. A serial killer had traded 4 lives for what amounted to a legal footnote, but the prosecutors had gotten what they needed: closure for the families and a formal conviction. They believed the 30 to 50-year sentence from the Gilbert case would be enough to keep Miller locked away for most of his life. They were wrong. The legal saga of Donald Gene Miller was far from over. It was, in fact, just beginning a new and agonizing chapter. After serving 10 years of his sentence, he became eligible to apply for parole in 1989. This was the first time the victims' families, the Youngs, the Gilberts, the friends of Marita, Wendy, and Christine, had to mobilize not for a trial, but to keep a killer in prison. They protested, they wrote letters, they made their voices heard. The parole board listened. They denied his release, citing the seriousness of his crimes. It was a victory, but a temporary one. Like a recurring nightmare, Miller applied for parole again in 1990, 1991, 1993, 1994, 1995, and 1997. Each time, the families had to relive their trauma, gather their strength, and fight the same battle. Each time, parole was denied, but the stress was taking a toll. The champions of their cause were aging. The public memory of Miller's crimes was fading, and a killer, sitting in his cell being a model inmate, was slowly inching his way toward a possible release date. Then, in 1997, a crucial discovery was made. A group called the Public Awareness and Protection Committee, led by Martha Sue Young's mother, Sue Young, was digging into Miller's prison record. They were looking for anything that could prove he remained dangerous. They found it. 3 years earlier, in 1994, guards at the Kinross Correctional Facility had conducted a search of Miller's cell. What they found was chilling in its simplicity: a shoelace, but this was not just a shoelace. Prison officials believed it had been fashioned into a garrote, a weapon used for strangling. They had confiscated it as contraband. At the time, it was treated as a minor prison infraction, but to Sue Young and the other advocates, it was a beacon. It was evidence that after all these years, Donald Gene Miller was still thinking about weapons, still thinking about strangulation. Sue Young took this information to the Chippewa County Prosecutor's office. They reviewed the case and decided to file new criminal charges against Miller for possession of a weapon in prison. Miller and his parents fought the charge vigorously. His attorney argued it was just an innocent shoelace, that there was no proof it was a weapon. The trial was tense. The jury was not allowed to hear about Miller's past as a serial killer. They were only deciding on the shoelace. It was a gamble. But when the jury returned a guilty verdict, the relief for the victims' families was immense. In 1998, Donald Gene Miller was sentenced to an additional 20 to 40 years in prison for possessing that weapon. Lisa Gilbert, the young girl he had attacked decades before, was at the hearing. She told a reporter, "Life without parole sounds better, but I'll take 20 to 40. This new sentence pushed his next parole eligibility date to October 2018. They had bought more time, but the clock never stops ticking in the Michigan prison system. Legal rulings and sentence recalculations moved that date. By 2016, Donald Gene Miller was up for parole again. Now in his 60s, He was described in prison records as a quiet, polite inmate who worked on the prison newspaper. But other notes in his file told a different story. One parole board member had written that Miller presented as remorseful, but they weren't sure he was genuine. The note stated he still expressed pain from rejection of his fiancée and ominously described him as a volcano ready to explode. The old warriors from the original cases rallied once more. Retired Judge Peter Houck, now in his 70s, spoke out forcefully, "He will kill again if he's out." Ernest Stewart, Christine's husband, now an elderly man, said the pain was still raw. He described Miller as one of the coldest people I've ever seen or met. And Randy Gilbert, the boy who had been stabbed 3 times, was now a man leading the fight to keep his attacker imprisoned. In September 2016, the parole board denied Miller's request. The cycle repeated in 2021, and again in 2022. Each time, prosecutors and victims submitted letters detailing why Miller should never be free. Eaton County prosecutor Doug Lloyd revealed a damning fact. Miller had last received sexual counseling in 1993. Counselors at that time concluded his coping mechanisms were unrealistic and terminated his treatment because he could not receive any further benefit. In other words, 3 decades ago, professionals determined he was untreatable. Nothing in the years since had changed that assessment. In May 2022, the parole board denied him again. This time, a new Michigan law allowed them to set his next hearing 5 years in the future, in 2027. It was a small mercy for the survivors, giving them a longer respite from the annual dread of the parole process. As of today, Donald Gene Miller, inmate number 157,793, remains behind bars at the G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility in Jackson, Michigan. His hair is gray now, his eyes still blue. If he serves his maximum sentence for all his crimes, his discharge date is set for May 3, 2031. He will be 76 years old. The story of the East Lansing serial killer is a story of 2 distinct timelines. One is frozen in the late 1970s, in the terror of those 18 months, in the grief that forever marked the families of Martha, Marita, Wendy, and Christine. The other timeline is a relentless, decades-long legal battle fought in parole hearing rooms by aging survivors and dedicated officials. It is a battle over a fundamental question. Can a man who once lived a double life as a model citizen and a ruthless predator ever truly be safe to rejoin society? The victims' families, the prosecutors, and the brother and sister who survived his violence believe the answer is a resounding no. They continue to wait and to watch the clock, knowing that in 2027 they will have to stand and fight once more, ensuring that the boy next door never gets to come home. The story of Donald Gene Miller didn't end with a cell door clanging shut. For the families of Martha Young, Marita Chiquette, Wendy Bush, and Christine Stewart, for the siblings Lisa and Randy Gilbert, and for the community of East Lansing, the summer of 1979 was not an ending, but the start of a different kind of sentence. While Don Miller began serving time in a Michigan prison, they began serving a life term of grief, vigilance, and a fight that would outlast decades. Inside the walls of the Michigan Department of Corrections, Donald Gene Miller was, by all administrative accounts, a model inmate. He was quiet, polite, and cooperative. He worked on the prison newspaper. To the system ticking along with routines and paperwork, he was just another number, aging, his hair turning gray, his blue eyes watching the years pass. He was the picture of institutional rehabilitation, but the people who knew what he was capable of saw a different picture entirely. They saw a predator in hibernation. For Randy Gilbert, the relief he felt when Miller was convicted in 1979 was profound, but tragically temporary. "At the time I thought, I'm never going to have to deal with this guy again," he recalled. He was a boy then, trying to heal from being stabbed 3 times and left for dead. But the justice system had a mechanism that would ensure he would have to deal with Miller again and again and again. Because of the structure of his sentences, 30 to 50 years for the attack on the Gilberts, with the 10 to 15-year manslaughter sentences running at the same time. Miller became eligible for parole in 1989. And so every year or two, like clockwork, a notice would arrive. The ritual of dread would begin anew. Randy and Lisa Gilbert, now adults carrying the invisible scars of childhood trauma, would have to prepare. They would gather their courage, confront their memories, and plead with a parole board to see the monster behind the model inmate's facade. It's gotten easier to talk about it, but it isn't any easier to deal with it, Randy said decades later. I live with this every single day of my life. Each hearing forced them to relive August 16, 1978. Lisa, who survived a brutal assault, and Randy, who survived a stabbing, were perpetually cast back into the role of victims, their healing interrupted by bureaucratic schedule. They were not alone. Martha Sue Young's mother, Sue Young, transformed her grief into a fierce, protective activism. She became the spearhead of a group called the Public Awareness and Protection Committee, whose sole mission was to ensure Donald Gene Miller never walked free. She knew the system could forget. She knew time could blur the horrors of the past. She was determined to be the keeper of the flame, the unwavering voice that would remind officials of the 4 women who were lost and the 2 children who were forever altered. This group of survivors, family members, and law enforcement officials became a watchdog network, and in the mid-1990s, their vigilance uncovered something that sent a chill through them all. During a routine search of Miller's cell at the Kinross Correctional Facility in 1994, guards found a simple, terrifying item, a 72-inch long shoelace. But this was no ordinary piece of string. It had been tied into a loop. Prison officials, trained to see potential in everyday objects, recognized its purpose immediately. It was a garrote, a weapon for strangulation. The very method Miller had used to kill Martha Young, Wendy Bush, and Christine Stewart. For Sue Young and the committee, this was not a minor infraction. It was a scream from the past, a direct line from the polite inmate in his cell to the killer who had terrorized East Lansing. It was proof that the mechanics of violence were still on his mind. They took this information to the Chippewa County Prosecutor's office, urging them to act. In 1998, Donald Gene Miller was put on trial once more, this time for possessing a weapon in prison. The Shoelace trial was a surreal and tense legal battle. Miller's defense, funded by his parents who still stood by him, argued it was an innocent item, perhaps a drawstring from a coat. Most critically, the judge ruled that the jury would not be told who Donald Gene Miller was. They were to deliberate on the nature of a piece of string, blind to the fact that the man on trial was a serial killer who had used strangulation as his preferred weapon. It was a staggering handicap for the prosecution, but the truth has a weight of its own. The jury saw the lace, understood its potential, and convicted him. Only after the verdict did they learn the full scope of Miller's crimes. Their reported shock confirmed what the victims' families knew. Context was everything. That conviction was a 4th felony, allowing him to be sentenced as a habitual offender. In 1998, nearly 20 years after his original sentencing, Miller was given an additional 20 to 40 years in prison. Lisa Gilbert, attending the hearing, summed up the bittersweet victory. Life without parole sounds better, but I'll take 20 to 40. That sentence was a shield. It pushed his next major parole eligibility date to October 2018. It bought time, but it did not buy peace. The parole hearings continued on a relentless loop. Each time, a coalition of the wounded would assemble. Letters would flood the parole board from Eaton County Prosecutor Doug Lloyd, from Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, from retired officials like former Ingham County Prosecutor Peter Houck. Their message was unified and urgent. He will kill again if he's out. They argued that Miller was uniquely dangerous and that nothing that's happened in prison erases the threat. The emotional toll was crushing. For the family of Christine Stewart, every hearing was a fresh assault. Her parents, Ken and Margaret Gusk, kept a bin of memories labeled Christine baby through death. They lived with the horrific duality of being grateful for the plea deal that finally let them bury their daughter, and enraged that the same deal gave her killer a chance at freedom. You hold on to that hope until there's nothing else. Until there is none, Margaret said of the year her daughter was missing. The process itself became a form of punishment for the survivors. Randy Gilbert described the exhausting cycle. Just a few months of respite after a parole denial before he had to start mentally preparing to fight the battle all over again. The system, designed to review inmates regularly, was perpetually re-victimizing the very people it was meant to serve. This relentless pressure and the high-profile advocacy around Miller's case finally sparked a change in Michigan law. In 2022, bipartisan legislation was signed, allowing the parole board to extend the time between hearings for violent offenders from 1 or 2 years to up to 5 years. Prosecutor Doug Lloyd directly credited the efforts of Randy and Lisa Gilbert for this change, which he said allows victims time to heal and limits the level of revictimization. But what of the man at the center of this decades-long storm? Who is Donald Gene Miller as he ages behind bars? Glimpses come from those who have interacted with him. Retired Eaton County Sergeant Rod Sadler, who authored a book on Miller, received letters from the inmate. In one, Miller attempted to explain his actions, writing that untreated I could, like a blocked steam pipe, only stockpile so much anger, frustration, and over 2-3 years accumulation via repression, I exploded. He claimed the 3 women he killed after Martha Young reminded him of her, triggering his violence. Notably, in all his writings to Sadler, he never mentioned or expressed remorse for the rape of 14-year-old Lisa Gilbert. His own longtime defense attorney, when asked by Sadler if Miller was still a danger, could only reply, "I don't know." That unsettling ambiguity hangs over every parole decision. Michigan's parole board has consistently denied his release, but the question of his inner life remains. Is he a reformed man, or is he, as a parole board member once noted in his file, a volcano ready to explode? The facts of his incarceration are cold and clear. As of today, Don Miller, MDOC number 157793, is a 71-year-old man with gray hair and blue eyes, held at the G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility. His maximum discharge date, if he serves every single day of all his sentences, is May 3, 2031. He will be 76 years old. But for those who survived him, the numbers are less important than the man. Randy Gilbert, now an adult who has spent more of his life fighting Miller than he did as a child victim of him, looks toward that 2031 date with apprehension. He's still going to be young enough to hurt somebody when he gets out of jail, Gilbert said. Please allow me to have the next 10 years to figure out what we are going to do next. Cheryl Krapf-Haddock, who as a 13-year-old girl helped comfort a naked and terrified Lisa Gilbert on the road in 1978, voices of fear shared by many. I don't think he'll serve through 2031. This case is totally forgotten. Her words underscore the central, chilling conflict between a prison system that must eventually release even its most notorious inmates and a community and a set of survivors who live with the certainty that this man's capacity for evil is not bound by time or age. The legal battles, the shoelace, the parole hearings, the new laws, all of it forms the second act of this tragedy. It is the long, grinding aftermath where the immediate terror has faded, but a permanent shadow remains. It is a story of a life sentence being served not just by the killer in his cell, but by everyone he touched with his violence. They wait, and they watch, and they remember what he did when he was a clean-cut boy next door, a youth minister with a bright future and a terrible, secret rage. The stage is now set for the final act. The next major date on the calendar is August 29, 2027. That is when Donald Gene Miller, now in his 70s, will once again sit before the Michigan Parole Board and ask for his freedom. The survivors will once again rally. The letters will once again be written. The same awful question will hang in the air. Is the boy next door finally gone, or has he just been waiting all this time? The clock in Michigan's parole board hearing room ticks with a sound that is both mundane and monumental. It measures ordinary minutes against the weight of decades-old grief, calculated risk, and the terrifying unknown of a man's mind. For over 40 years, that ticking has been the soundtrack to a waiting game no one wanted to play. The story of Donald Gene Miller is no longer about the crimes of the 1970s or even the legal battles of the 1990s. It is about the present and a future that hangs in the balance. It is about the final, unanswerable question: what happens when the system designed to contain a monster must one day consider setting him free? Today, Donald Gene Miller is inmate number 157,793. He is 71 years old. His hair, once brown, is gray. His eyes are still blue. He resides at the G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility in Jackson, Michigan. On paper, his path is straightforward. His maximum discharge date is May 3, 2031. He would be 76. This date is a mathematical endpoint, the sum of all his sentences. But in the real world of parole boards, victim advocacy, and human fear, that date is anything but certain. The next major decision point is not 2031. It is August 29, 2027. On that day, under the provisions of the new law his victims helped create, Miller will have his next parole hearing. It will be the most critical one yet. The people who will stand against his release are older now, their lives forever framed by his violence. Randy Gilbert is no longer the 13-year-old boy fighting for his life on his living room floor. He is a man, a father, who has spent more years fighting Miller in parole hearings than he spent as a child before the attack. The ordeal forged him into a formidable advocate, but the cost is etched into his words. "I live with this every single day of my life," he has said. "It's gotten easier to talk about it, but it isn't any easier to deal with it." For him and his sister Lisa, the concept of moving on is a myth. They are in a permanent state of vigilance. The families of the 4 murdered women walk a parallel path of everlasting sorrow. The parents of Christine Stewart and Martha Sue Young lived into old age, carrying a pain that never faded. They are gone now, passing their torch of memory to siblings, to friends, to prosecutors who promised them justice. The community of East Lansing itself is a different place. The students at Michigan State now are the grandchildren of those who lived through the fear. Time moves on, but for the small, determined group of survivors and officials, time is circular. Every 5 years, it loops back to that hearing room. Their argument is not based on revenge. It is based on a cold, clinical assessment of danger built on 2 pillars: what Miller did and who he has shown himself to be since. The first pillar is the crimes themselves. Prosecutors like Eaton County's Doug Lloyd and Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel meticulously detail them in every parole objection letter. They recount not just the 4 murders, but the sadistic, calculating nature behind them. The posed scene with Martha Young's clothing, the mutilation of Marita Chiquette, the abduction and killing of strangers who simply reminded him of a rejection, and crucially, the attack on Lisa and Randy Gilbert, a crime committed after he had already killed 4 times, proving an escalating, uncontrollable compulsion. This is not the profile of a man who killed in a single, impassioned fit of rage. It is the profile of a serial predator. The second, and perhaps more chilling, pillar is Miller's own psychological footprint during his incarceration. The official record is damning. A parole board member once noted in his file that Miller presented as remorseful, but seemed to be a volcano ready to explode. Most critically, his last participation in sexual offender counseling was in 1993. The counselors at that time did not discharge him because he was cured. They terminated his treatment because they concluded he could not receive any further benefit from it. His coping mechanisms were deemed unrealistic. In the language of therapy, this is a professional dead end. He was deemed, essentially, untreatable over 30 years ago, and there is no evidence anything has changed. Miller's own words, in letters to author and retired Sergeant Rod Sadler, are revealing. He wrote analytically about his crimes, describing a buildup of anger like a blocked steam pipe that exploded. He claimed the women he killed after Martha Young reminded him of her. It is a narrative of external triggers, of being overwhelmed by feelings. Conspicuously absent is any mention of Lisa Gilbert. The 14-year-old girl he raped and tried to murder is erased from his explanatory tale. This is not the language of profound, empathetic remorse. It is the language of justification, of a man still trying to rationalize the irrational. So who will the parole board see in 2027? They will see an elderly man, polite and soft-spoken, a model inmate who has caused no trouble in years. They will hear from his advocates, perhaps even family members, who will speak of the man they know, the man who has been punished enough. And then they will hear from Randy Gilbert. They will read the letters from prosecutors outlining the untreatable diagnosis. They will review the file that mentions the volcano. They will be faced with the impossible calculus of risk. Can they ever be sure? What weight does the model behavior of an elderly inmate carry against the confessed actions of a young, methodical killer? Is good behavior in a controlled, regimented prison environment any predictor of behavior in the chaotic, stressful world outside? For the survivors, the answer is clear. Retired prosecutor Peter Houck, now in his 70s, has never wavered. He will kill again if he's out. This is the ultimate twist in the story of the East Lansing serial killer. The great twist is not a hidden clue or a surprise witness. It is time itself. The passage of decades has not brought resolution. It has only deepened the mystery at the heart of the case, the mystery of Donald Gene Miller's mind. The clean-cut college student, the youth minister, the serial killer, the model inmate. Which of these men is real? Are they all fragments of one shattered whole, or was the polite facade the only real thing, a mask worn so well it even fooled its wearer? The legal story has an endpoint, 2031. The human story does not. For the survivors, the sentence they are serving has no maximum discharge date. Randy Gilbert looks toward the future with the weary resolve of a soldier who knows the war never ends. He's still going to be young enough to hurt somebody when he gets out of jail, Gilbert said. Please allow me to have the next 10 years to figure out what we're going to do next. As August 29, 2027, draws closer, a quiet town in Michigan, two siblings who survived a childhood horror, and a state's justice system will all turn their attention once more to a 73-year-old man in a prison cell. They will listen to his words. They will weigh his risk. They will decide if the boy next door, after a lifetime of confinement, can ever be allowed to come home. The final question hangs in the air, as heavy and silent as the grief that started it all. When a human being proves himself capable of such darkness, who among us can ever say, with certainty, that the light has finally returned?